The desert spat him out at high noon, sun cracked and swaying, boots dragging a trench in the sand. By sundown he would have been bones, if the triplets hadn't found him first. He staggered across the salt flats like a dying steer, hand pressed to his gut where the blood wouldn't stop coming. Every step was a prayer, not the kind said out loud, but the kind a man makes with grit in his teeth and judgment on his heels. The sheriff's badge, caked with dust and gone dull from the heat, clung to his chest like it, too, was holding on for dear life. His name was Sheriff Darden Holt. Folks in Eden Ridge spoke it low, not because they feared him, but because they respected the weight of it. 30 years riding the line between right and ruin. 30 years cleaning up the messes made by desperate men with nothing left to lose. Darden had held the town together with steady hands and a quicker draw than anyone had a right to expect at his age. Until one morning, he simply rode out without a word and didn't return. That was 5 days ago. Now the wind howled like a mother in mourning. No horses, no water, just sand, thorns, and heat that peeled a man's sanity off his bones. He collapsed near a cluster of sun-withered mesquites, blood soaking through his coat, breath rattling like a loose hinge. He wouldn't make it to midnight. He knew that much. But 3 girls were watching from the rocks. They'd seen him fall. Triplets, each barely 14, not born of this town nor claimed by it, dressed in mismatched prairie skirts, hand-me-down boots, and the kind of suspicion only orphans carried in their eyes. They had no last name, no family but one another, and no reason to trust a dying man who looked half wolf and half ghost. The boldest of them, Ada, climbed down first. She didn't speak, just crouched beside the sheriff and touched 2 fingers to the side of his neck. He flinched, alive. "He's still got breath," she muttered, "but not for long." The second girl, Ruth, hung back. Fear curled her shoulders. "He's a sheriff," she said. "He'll bring trouble." Ada ignored her. The third, Clara, stood silent with fists clenched at her sides, her wide gray eyes locked on the blood. They had a choice. Leave him, let the desert finish what it started, or save a man who could ask questions about why 3 girls lived wild in the canyons with no kin, no home, and no papers. The answer wasn't simple. Nothing ever was when you lived between the cracks of the world. But Clara stepped forward first. "I'll help carry," she whispered. By the time night fell, the 3 girls had half-dragged, half-pushed Darden's broken body to a dry cave mouth sheltered from the wind. They built a fire. They cut away the fabric from his wound. They boiled water over hot stones and cleaned the dirt from his skin like they'd done for dying rabbits, and one of their own after a fall. Ada stitched the worst of the damage using thread torn from the hem of her skirt and a fish hook flattened to a needle. Ruth nearly fainted twice, but didn't stop pouring water. Darden never fully woke. His lips twitched. Sometimes he mumbled things that sounded like names. Other times he screamed so sudden that Ruth ran from the cave, but he never opened his eyes. 2 nights passed, still no full wakefulness, and by the 3rd they began to wonder if he ever would. But Ada wasn't ready to bury him, not after the 2nd fever broke and the bleeding slowed, not after she'd stayed awake all night pressing cloth to his brow and whispering, "You don't get to die, not here, not yet." Because she'd seen something. A note half-crushed in his coat pocket, blood-stained but legible. "Deputy found dead. I'm riding south. Tell Maureen not to wait." No signature, just the handwriting of a man who never expected to make it back. And inside his other coat pocket, a tiny sketch of a girl with braids, a child, not older than 8. It changed everything. The triplets knew what it meant to be left behind. They'd once been that girl in the drawing. And now, they weren't just saving a stranger. They were holding onto the last hope of someone's father. On the 4th morning, Darden woke, just enough to lift his head and whisper one word through cracked lips. "Maureen." Clara's hand found his. "She's waiting," she lied. "You just rest." But something else stirred behind his half-lidded gaze. Panic, pain. He gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise. "They'll come for her," he rasped. Tell Owen no, he's gone, he's..." He slipped back into unconsciousness before the name could finish, but the tremor that lingered in his hand said enough. Whoever had left the sheriff to die in the desert wasn't done yet. And they weren't after him anymore. They were after his blood. The girls exchanged glances. They were no strangers to bad men. They'd run from them, hidden, fought, but this was different. This wasn't about survival. This was about protecting something bigger than themselves. Ada reached into his coat again, found a folded map marked with a crude circle southeast of Eden Ridge. A cabin, a trail, the words safe house scrawled beside it. "We need to go there," she said. "Whoever's in that house, they're in danger." Ruth shook her head. "We don't know what we're walking into." Ada nodded. Neither did he. By nightfall, they'd fashioned a travois out of mesquite branches and their own blankets, bundled the sheriff into it, and started toward the cabin. The desert did not make it easy. Every dune was a mountain, every shadow a threat. They had no food beyond a sack of dried peaches, and no water after the second canteen sprang a leak. But they walked. Triplets half-wild, all heart. And behind them, just beyond the rise of the hills, hoofbeats began to echo across the hardpan. Steady, methodical. Not fast enough to catch them yet, but close enough to be real. By the second day on foot, the mountains began to crowd them. The air thinned, the wind sharpened, and shadows moved longer than seemed right. The sheriff barely stirred now, his skin gone to parchment and lips dry as old rope. He mumbled sometimes, names mostly. Once he called out for Maureen. Another time, just before dawn, he screamed. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was grief. Ada hushed him with a steady palm across his forehead, though her own heart was jackhammering against her ribs. Clara had seen it too. The way the birds stopped chirping at the exact moment Darden cried out. The wind stilled. It was like something was listening. Something not far behind. They pushed harder after that. Not because they wanted to, but because the sound of hooves kept playing tricks on them, faint, then loud, then gone. Ruth said it was just in their heads, but Ruth always said that, even when it was. That's how she survived things she didn't want to believe. They stopped only once that evening to rest and shift Darden's weight. He was too big for them to carry long, even with the travois. Clara's shoulder was raw from the leather strap she'd tied around it. Ada's boots were bleeding at the heels. Ruth's palms were blistered, but she wouldn't admit it, not when there were still hours of walking left. At twilight, they finally saw the cabin. It was nestled low between two cracked boulders on the edge of a dry arroyo, half hidden by juniper and mesquite. The kind of place you'd never find if you weren't looking for it. Clara spotted smoke curling from the chimney. Not much, just a thread, but it meant someone was inside. Ruth went rigid. What if it's them? Ada crouched low and studied the ground. If it was them, they wouldn't leave smoke. They'd come quiet. She handed Clara a rock. "You're going to knock." Clara stared. "Why me?" "Because you don't look scared." Clara blinked. "I am." "Then pretend better than me." She swallowed hard and stepped toward the door. The knock echoed, 3 short raps, nothing more. The door creaked, slow, uncertain. Then a face appeared behind the frame. A woman, young, not more than 20, with dark hair drawn tight behind her ears and a baby cradled against her chest. The woman took one look at Clara and flinched. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "They're coming." Clara didn't ask who. She just turned and waved the others forward. The woman's name was June. Her child, barely 2, was named Levi. She didn't know Darden personally, but she recognized the badge. She took one look at the sheriff's wound and went pale. "They said he was dead," she murmured. Ada caught that. "Who said?" June hesitated. "Men, 2 of them, came through here 2 days ago. Said they were looking for someone who'd gone rogue, asked if I'd seen anyone bleeding." "And you told them no?" "I told them I was just a girl with a baby and a shotgun, and they didn't argue." Ada believed her. There was a rifle behind the door, clean and loaded. June might have looked soft, but there was steel under the skin. Ruth helped lay the sheriff on a narrow cot near the hearth. June fetched herbs, water, rags. She moved fast, but her hands shook. "He's not going to last long without more help," she whispered. "We're all he's got," Ada said. June's eyes lingered on the sheriff's face. Why would 3 girls risk all this for a dying man? Clara answered for all of them. Because he didn't leave her behind. June looked down at her son. She understood. The next hours were quiet, too quiet. Clara watched the ridgelands. Ruth slept sitting up. Ada tried boiling roots to make broth Darden might swallow. He didn't, but he breathed, barely. It wasn't until midnight that the sound came again. Not hoofbeats this time. Voices. Low, close male. The triplets were already moving. They pressed close to the ground and slipped out the side window like smoke. June handed her child a biscuit and cocked the shotgun. Two men stood by the trees, one with a gray coat and white hat, the other broader, scarred down one cheek. They didn't knock. "You think she's hiding him?" Scarred Face asked. "Maybe. Woman like that's easy to overlook." White Hat spat into the dirt. "Sheriff's too close to dead to matter. We need to find the girl." "Which one?" "The daughter." Clara felt the air freeze. Ada turned slowly, eyes wide. "Daughter." The triplets huddled behind the water barrels until the men finally moved off, muttering about riding north. They didn't try the door, didn't see the tracks leading to the arroyo, but their boots left prints, and Clara counted how long the horses stood still before they left. 3 minutes too long. It wasn't a casual visit. They'd be back. Dawn bled into the sky. Ada found June boiling linens, pressing heat to Darden's side. She didn't look up when the girl sat down. "You heard them." June nodded. "Daughter." "He was married once," June said. "To my older sister. She died in childbirth." Ada stared. "He never told anyone. Said the badge made enemies. Said the best way to keep Maureen safe was to keep her hidden." "Maureen," Ada whispered. "The name he keeps saying." June nodded. "My niece." Ada felt the bottom fall out of her chest. All this time, she thought they were saving a sheriff. Turns out, they were the only thing between a father and the daughter no one knew he had. The next hours moved like smoke, slow, curling, thick with tension. Clara packed bags. Ruth sharpened sticks into spears. Ada studied the map again, trying to find another place they could run to. But the desert was a wide mouth, and they were already inside it. Darden woke briefly. He whispered something Ada couldn't catch. She leaned in closer. "You have to tell me, who are they?" He blinked slowly, then croaked, "Used to wear stars, took money to look away." Ada's stomach turned. Deputies. Crooked lawmen. That's who had left him to die. And now they were hunting his daughter to silence whatever he knew. "They won't stop," Darden rasped. "If they find her, tell her." His voice trailed off. He didn't finish the sentence. Ada turned to Clara. "We're not waiting." "We can't move him," Clara said. "We're not moving him. We're drawing them away." June stepped forward. "What are you thinking?" Ada's voice didn't shake. "We give them what they want." Ruth's mouth fell open. "You mean Maureen?" "No," Ada said. "I mean me." By nightfall, Clara had braided Ada's hair like the drawing in the sheriff's pocket. June gave her one of Maureen's old dresses, faded yellow gingham, too short at the sleeves. She looked like the sketch, enough to fool men who were only guessing. Ada tied herself to a tree just outside the old trail the men were watching. Clara smeared dirt on her cheeks, bruised her arms with ash. Then she waited. The moon rose. And the hoofbeats came again. Only this time they didn't pass. They stopped. White Hat saw her first. He dropped from his saddle with a curse. Scarred Face grinned like a fox. "Well, well," he said. "Looks like the lawman's girl got lost." Ada didn't flinch. She spat in the dirt. They stepped closer. And that's when Clara struck. She came from behind the mesquite with the shovel, straight for Scarred Face's knee. It shattered with a crunch that sent him down screaming. Ruth hurled a stone into White Hat's temple, then leapt for the reins of his horse. June fired once from the porch, missed. But it was enough. The men fled into the canyon, Scarred Face dragging one leg. Ada stood, wrists bleeding, breath ragged but unbroken. Behind her the sheriff groaned. And then he said her name. Maureen. He was looking right at her. But it wasn't her. And he knew it. Ada stepped forward. "Not yet, Sheriff," she whispered, "but we'll get her to you." And for the first time in days, he smiled. By the time dawn crept over the jagged peaks, the canyon floor was painted with the aftermath. Scarred faces' blood trailed toward the north ridge, and the echo of the rifle shot still lived somewhere deep between the stones. Clara stood over the broken tree root where she'd swung her shovel, hand red to the wrist, breath slow but steady. Her knuckles trembled not from fear, but from something worse: doubt. Ada moved first. She pressed a hand to Clara's shoulder, grounding her, as Ruth came limping out of the scrub with White Hat's horse in tow. They hadn't caught either man, but they hadn't been caught either, and more importantly, Darden was still alive. Barely. They bundled the sheriff back inside and lowered him into the cot again. June had boiled water through the night and torn all her linens into strips. Darden's wound looked cleaner, but his skin was still too pale, his pulse too faint. He drifted in and out, sometimes gasping as though pulled under by a current only he could see. Clara washed her hands in silence. Ruth stood at the window, chewing on her lip. She'd seen something before the men fled, something she hadn't spoken on yet. Ada caught her eye. "What is it?" They weren't riding the same horses. Ada frowned. So they traded at least once, probably got fresh mounts somewhere nearby. "Which means they have help." Ruth nodded. "Help, that's close." June overheard and paled. "There's only one ranch north of here, about 5 miles. No families, just hired hands, real private. Folks say they move cattle, but no one ever hears the herds." Clara dried her hands. "You think they're hiding out there?" June hesitated. "I think that's where they plan to finish it." Ada crossed the room and grabbed the map. She traced a finger from their cabin to the northern bluff, then down to the dry creek that cut through the ravine. If they followed it, they could flank the ranch without being seen. Ruth followed her thinking. "And do what? Spy, ask questions?" "No," Ada said. "We burn it." Clara blinked. "Burn it?" Ada turned. Her face was stone. "Whatever's out there, whoever's helping them, they won't stop. Not until the sheriff's dead, not until his daughter's dead. We hit first. Hard." Ruth didn't argue. Clara didn't either. Because in that moment, they weren't just 3 girls anymore. They were the last defense between a dying man and the grave being dug for his legacy. The trek started at nightfall. June gave them what she could: food, matches, a single rifle with 6 bullets. She stayed behind with Darden cradling Levi in one arm and a knife in the other. Ada didn't want to leave them alone, but they didn't have a choice. The triplets moved quiet, fast. Dust coated their teeth, thorns chewed their calves, but they didn't stop. Not once. Not until the shape of the ranch cut against the moonlight: long buildings, low corrals, a water tower leaning like it was ashamed to stand. They waited under the rim of the ridge, until the last lamp in the bunkhouse went black. Then they moved. Ada took the barn. Ruth circled toward the storage shed. Clara waited until the wind shifted, then crept into the haystack closest to the corral. She carried the matches. And she wasn't afraid to use them. 10 minutes later, fire danced. It licked the hay, kissed the wood, snapped across the corral in wild orange tongues. Horses screamed. Men burst from the bunkhouse, shouting, fumbling with guns and boots. Ada knocked one flat with the butt of the rifle. Ruth threw a lantern into the grain stores. Clara set fire to the saddle shed and then took cover behind a trough. The whole place lit like Judgment Day. But they'd miscounted the men. 6 had come out. 3 more came from the smoke. One grabbed Clara by the hair and threw her to the dirt. Another tackled Ruth and pinned her shoulder with a boot. Ada ran toward her sisters, rifle raised, but a 4th man stepped out of the haze and leveled a pistol. It wasn't Scarred Face, and it wasn't White Hat. It was someone worse. Dressed in deputy gray. A tin star still pinned to his chest. He was older but not old, clean-shaven, lips thin as thread. When he spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. "Where is he?" Ada said nothing. He raised the pistol. "Don't play smart. I saw the tracks. I know you girls dragged him out. That sheriff wasn't supposed to last the night." Ruth spit into the dust. "Guess you ain't good at finishing things." The man's face didn't move. "You don't understand. That man ruined everything. One report, one complaint to the marshal. He would have sunk 10 years of work, so we buried it. And him. Clara groaned from the dirt. Then why keep hunting? The deputy's gaze sharpened. Because he had a daughter. He stepped forward. Didn't he? Ada felt the breath leave her chest. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a vendetta. But before the deputy could move again, before he could raise the gun, there was a sound from the ridge. A second rifle cracked. Then another. The deputy's shoulder jerked. He spun, blood blooming across his sleeve. Clara rolled free. Ruth kicked the man pinning her and scrambled to her feet. Ada didn't wait. She grabbed the gun and ran. More shots rang out behind them. Someone had come. And they weren't shooting at the girls. They were aiming for the men with badges. The triplets didn't stop until they reached the dry creek. The flames were still visible behind them, distant now but roaring, endless. Whoever had fired those shots didn't follow. Not yet. They collapsed beneath the canyon wall. Ada counted bruises. Ruth wrapped her shoulder in a scarf. Clara threw up into the dust. Then Ruth looked up. Who do you think fired those shots? Ada shook her head. Doesn't matter. All that matters is we use the time. They turned back toward the cabin. The wind picked up. And something behind them whispered their names. When they reached the cabin, June met them at the door. He woke up again, she said breathlessly, but only for a minute. Did he say anything? Ada asked. June nodded. He said he remembers. Ada stiffened. Remembers what? June looked shaken. The name of the man who started it all. The sisters leaned in close. June whispered the name. And every one of them froze. Because it wasn't a stranger. It was someone they'd all seen in town. Someone who gave out candy to children. Someone who wore a sheriff's badge once. And hadn't been seen since Darden took over. Ada sat down slowly. Then it was never about justice. No, June said, it was about revenge. But that night they heard the hoofbeats again. Only this time they weren't faint. They were coming straight for the cabin. June locked the door. Ruth checked the bullets. Clara held the shovel like a war axe. Ada knelt beside Darden. You need to stay awake, she whispered, just a little longer. His eyes fluttered. Then steadied. They're coming, he rasped. I know. He reached for her hand. I'm sorry. Don't be, just hold on. He looked past her, into the smoke curling under the doorframe. They'll never stop. Clara stepped forward. Yes, they will. And then she threw open the door. The door flew open, and the night howled in like a thing alive, dust spinning in ghostly spirals, heat pressing hard against their faces. Clara stood in the frame, shovel raised, teeth clenched, eyes fierce with something far older than fear. Behind her, Ada and Ruth spread out to the sides of the door, pressing close to the walls, each holding their breath as hooves tore up the earth just beyond the edge of the porch. They weren't just riders, they were a hunt. 6 men on horseback thundered across the yard, rifles drawn, lanterns swinging from their saddles. The leader, the one from the ranch with the fresh badge and older hate, rode straight for the cabin. He dismounted before the dust even settled, bootsteps pounding up the porch boards like war drums. Ada didn't wait. She came out from the side and swung the rifle like a club, catching him just under the chin. He dropped backward, stunned, weapon skidding from his hand. Ruth was already on the second one, pulling him off his saddle as his horse reared. Clara didn't hesitate. She charged the third man and drove the edge of the shovel into his thigh. He screamed, fell, rolled into the dirt clutching his leg. The other 3 scattered, firing blind into the dark. One bullet splintered the front beam of the cabin. Another tore through the edge of the window. Inside, June threw herself over Darden, shielding him with her own body as glass exploded above them. Ada ducked behind the water trough, reloading the rifle. Ruth scrambled toward the chicken pen, dragging a rope behind her. Clara picked up one of the dropped revolvers and crouched near the fence line, breath fast, eyes scanning the brush. Then a voice cut through the chaos. You girls don't know what you're protecting. It was the man with the badge again. His lip was bleeding, his eyes wild. That man in there, your precious sheriff, he was part of it once. The blood, the silence. He didn't stop it until it got too close to home. Ada yelled back. Then why'd you try to finish the job he turned against? He didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer. Just pride. And hate. And fear of being buried by the truth. The next 20 minutes blurred into fury. One by one, the triplets pulled the riders from their horses, using the shadows, the terrain, their own scars as weapons. Ruth lashed a man to the porch beam. Clara emptied the revolver into the sky to draw fire away from Ada. Ada lit a second torch and hurled it into the brush, setting a ring of fire around the back of the cabin to keep them from circling again. By dawn, only 2 men remained standing. One was the badge man, bleeding breath ragged, gun raised. The other was someone the girls hadn't seen before. But Darden had. Even from his cot, even half-blind with fever, the sound of that voice brought him upright. Hello again, Sheriff. The girls turned toward the man. He wasn't in uniform, wore no badge, no nameplate, just a scar across his collarbone and a grin that had no warmth in it. Darden gritted his teeth. Marshal Harlow. Ada stepped forward, gun trembling in her hands. Marshal. Harlow tipped his head like a man being greeted at church. He used to be my superior, Darden said slowly, before I found out what he was covering, before I sent the report that disappeared. Wasn't personal, Harlow said lightly, just business. Then why burn the town to bury it? Harlow's smile thinned. Because some things stay buried, and when they don't, people start asking questions that get folks killed. Ruth spit in the dirt, like us. Like everyone, Harlow said. He raised his gun. But Darden did something none of them expected. He stood. He pushed off the cot, limped forward on shaking legs, leaned on the edge of the doorframe. June cried out and reached to steady him, but he waved her off. Don't, he said. His voice wasn't strong, but it was steady. Don't touch me like I'm a corpse. He faced Harlow. You've been chasing my silence for a long time, Marshal. You should have stopped when I buried your report in front of the governor himself. The man's eyes narrowed. Liar. I'm a dying man, Darden said. What do I gain from lying now? That moment, those 5 seconds, held something electric. Harlow's hand didn't waver. But his jaw twitched. Because maybe, just maybe, the old sheriff had told the truth. The kind of truth that didn't need proof. Only witnesses. Ada stepped beside her father. She raised her rifle. So did Ruth. So did Clara. 3 daughters. 1 dying sheriff. And every secret worth killing for hanging in the air like lightning waiting to strike. Shoot him, Harlow whispered. The badge man hesitated. Shoot him. But he didn't. Because the wind shifted. And behind them, coming up over the ridge, were 20 riders. Real deputies. Real lawmen. June had sent the flare while no one was watching. The cabin had been under observation since Darden vanished. All they'd needed was a sign. Now the sign had come. And it burned brighter than fire. By noon it was over. The crooked men were shackled. The triplets were treated for their wounds. Darden was moved to the proper facility, flanked by guards who saluted him like he was still wearing the badge. And the triplets. They didn't speak much that day. But they didn't need to. Because everyone saw what they'd done. And no one would forget it. 3 weeks later, the town held a hearing. Not for Darden, but for the truth. Testimonies were read, names exposed, deals unearthed like graves. Some old hands retired early. Some new ones swore in with tears on their cheeks. The force was changed. But it wasn't just policy. It was the people. Because for the first time in years, the ones who needed protection were finally seen. And 3 girls with nothing but their father's name and each other. They became legend. Late one night, Clara stood on the ridge where they'd first heard the hoofbeats. She looked down at the valley. The cabin had been rebuilt, stronger this time. Darden walked with a cane now, but walked still. Ruth had taken over the horse training. Ada had filed paperwork with the academy. They weren't the same girls, but they'd never been more themselves. Clara heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn. You think they'll ever try again? Ada's voice was soft. Someone always will. Clara nodded. Then we'll be ready. They stood in silence a long while, watching the horizon. Not for danger, but for whatever came next. Because that was the thing about stories like theirs. They didn't end. They echoed. The hospital smelled like bleach and old metal. No matter how often they changed the sheets or wiped the rails, there was something in the air that clung to the soul, a scent not of death but of what comes before it. Darden lay in the corner room, top floor, with a view of the mountains. The window stayed open, not for air, but because a man like him couldn't bear to be boxed in, not even by recovery. He was healing slowly. The bullet that had burrowed near his ribs hadn't claimed him, nor had the desert, nor had the fever that came after, but the pain was constant. It lived in his joints and spine and memories. It reminded him that he was still here, not by luck, not by grace, but by the stubborn refusal to die before he'd finished what he started. Clara sat beside his bed with her boots kicked off and one leg tucked beneath her. She didn't speak much. She read aloud sometimes, from the paper, from the report the marshal tried to bury, from letters arriving from corners of the territory Darden hadn't even known paid attention. But mostly, she just stayed. Any word from Ada? He asked one morning, voice gravelly with sleep. Clara didn't look up. She made it to Albuquerque, past the first round. He smiled faintly. I knew she would. She said the other cadets think she's soft because she's small. Darden chuckled, a sound that caught in his chest like a match to tinder. She's the meanest of the three. She'll be fine. Clara closed the book. You don't think she's too angry for the badge? No, Darden said. The badge needs more people who are angry for the right reasons. They fell quiet again. The kind of quiet that was earned. Earned through fire and blood, and holding each other up when the rest of the world tried to break them. Meanwhile, Ruth was turning the ranch into something different. The livestock had doubled. The fence lines extended another 40 acres. And every Sunday, a small group of children from the nearby settlement came to learn how to ride. Not because Ruth wanted to teach, but because she'd seen what happened when the young didn't have something, or someone, to trust. She built a new barn too. Put her name on it. Not Darden's. Not their mother's. Hers. Ruth's Gate, it read. People asked what it meant. She never explained. But Clara understood. The gate that held firm. And didn't let evil pass. Then one morning, a letter arrived. Clara found it in the mailbox tied shut with a blue ribbon. No return address. Just her name, written in a hand she hadn't seen since they were children. She opened it on the porch, coffee in hand. And by the end of the second paragraph, she dropped the mug and didn't notice the shards. Ruth came running. Clara. Clara handed her the page. And both girls read it twice, just to be sure. Their mother wasn't dead. She had never been dead. It came out like smoke through a vent. Their mother had faked her death, disappeared the night the town fire took the old courthouse and half the records inside it. Darden had believed she perished in the flames, so had the girls. No body was ever recovered, no grave was ever filled. But she had run, because she knew too much. And someone had threatened to use her daughters as leverage. She left to protect them. She sent letters for years, most never delivered, intercepted, destroyed, buried under names that didn't exist anymore. But now, after all this time, she'd found a way to reach them. Because she'd heard what they'd done. And she knew the danger hadn't ended. Not really. Not ever. Clara stared out across the pasture as the sun dropped low. She was alive this whole time, she said softly. Ruth stood behind her, and he didn't know. Clara nodded. If he had, he would have found her. He would have burned down the world to do it. They sat on the porch until the sky turned purple and the first owl called from the trees. And then, without a word, they packed a saddlebag. Not out of revenge, but out of something older. Older than blood. Older than the hurt. Duty. They left at dawn. No goodbye. Just a note for Darden that read, "We're chasing the truth again." Ada met them in Santa Fe. She hadn't cut her hair, but she wore the academy jacket and a deputy's badge, provisional, with her name stamped deep into the brass. "What if it's not her?" Ada asked quietly. Clara looked at her. "Then we bring her to justice." Ruth added, "And if it is her?" Clara's voice cracked. "Then we bring her home." The letter led them south, to a dust-bitten mining town, tucked between two jagged ridges, where the sun never seemed to rise gently. They rode in with hats low and eyes scanning. The saloon was too quiet. The general store too neat. And every face they passed watched a little too long. "She's here," Ada said. Clara pointed at the church steeple rising over the rest. "Start there." They climbed the steps and pushed open the doors. Inside, a woman knelt at the altar, hands folded, shoulders thin beneath a linen shawl. She didn't turn when they entered. Didn't flinch. Just finished her prayer. When she rose, she didn't look at them. Just smiled toward the front pew. "3 pairs of boots," she said. "3 breaths I'd know in my sleep." She turned. Her hair was silver. Her face thinner. But it was her. The same eyes. The same scar under the chin Ruth had once asked about 100 times. "Mama," Clara whispered. She stepped forward. Then stopped. Because the woman's eyes weren't just warm. They were afraid. "You can't be here," their mother said. Ada stepped closer. "Why not?" "Because they're watching." Clara asked who. But the answer came too fast. Gunfire exploded through the windows. The girls hit the floor as glass rained down. The church bell screamed above them, as if heaven itself was being ripped apart. Their mother dove behind the altar, dragging a satchel of letters and maps with her. "Who's after you?" Ruth shouted. "The ones who helped Harlow," she gasped. "He was never alone." Ada fired through the shattered window, dropping one man before the second round drove her back down. The pews splintered under the storm of bullets. And still their mother crawled forward, pulling her daughters with her. "I ran to keep you safe," she sobbed. "You made us strong," Clara said back. The words weren't soft. They were steel. Because this time they weren't running. This time they were finishing what their father started. Outside, smoke thickened. The town wasn't just a hideout. It was a nest. Of the last men who had buried the truth and made a fortune off silence. And they were ready to kill to keep it buried. But the girls weren't alone. Because the moment the flare went up again, blue this time, a dozen riders crested the ridge behind them. Real lawmen. Ada's instructors. Darden's old friends. One of them had read the Triplet's story in the Santa Fe papers. And they'd followed the signs here. Because justice doesn't rest just because the war changes hands. It ended in 20 minutes. The dust hadn't even settled before cuffs were being slapped on wrists and names were written into the record books. Their mother was taken into protective custody. But she didn't fight. She just hugged each daughter once, hard, tearful, and whispered a different sentence to each of them. To Clara, you kept the fire. To Ada, you chose the sword. To Ruth, you became the gate. And when the transport took her north, she didn't look back. Because she knew they would come visit. And she knew her husband was still waiting. When the triplets returned home, Darden was on the porch, blanket around his shoulders. He didn't ask questions. He just stood, walked to them, and held them all at once. Then Clara whispered, "She's alive." And the sheriff, once thought dead in the desert, once broken by the world, closed his eyes. And whispered, "I knew she had to be." Because some loves never die. They just get buried under the dust. waiting to be unearthed by the daughters of truth. The first frost came late that year, blanketing the valley in white just as the last of the harvest wagons pulled in. The mountains loomed sharper, colder. Coyotes kept close to the brush, their cries thin and uncertain under the changing wind. Darden sat at the edge of the porch with a scarf pulled high across his neck, his breath fogging in the early light. He watched Ruth haul firewood alone and didn't move to help. She wouldn't let him if he tried. Behind him, Ada was cleaning her weapon with a level of focus that had become second nature. The academy had changed her posture, made her sharper in ways that weren't just physical. She still smiled when Ruth or Clara teased her, but it was rarer now, the kind of smile you had to earn. And Clara, she wasn't around. Not since the letter came. The second one. This one signed with initials no one recognized, but which had shaken her more than the sound of the first shot in that church. It had arrived folded inside a parcel, wrapped in thick oilskin. No address. Just the word forgive, written across the top. Inside, a photograph of their mother, bound and blindfolded. And one line, we let you find her, now it's your turn. Clara hadn't spoken since she read it. She packed a saddlebag and left before the sun broke the next morning. Ruth and Ada found the letter minutes later, still warm from her hands. Darden read it once and didn't say a word. He just gripped the cane harder and went inside. Clara rode straight south. No towns. No stops. No sleep. The mare collapsed somewhere past Gila Bend, and she went the rest of the way on foot, skin burned, lips cracked, boots full of cactus thorn. She didn't care. Because if they wanted her to follow, she'd let them see what that truly meant. She reached the pass where 3 rivers met like braided rope, and there she found the sign. 3 stones stacked high, each one marked with a carved cross. She kicked the stones down and waited. Nothing happened. Then a voice rose from the dark. You were faster than we thought. Clara didn't draw. Not yet. She recognized the voice. It had belonged to the man who'd come into the sheriff's office 4 years ago asking about a missing wagon. He looked poor, desperate, claimed his wife and daughter had been taken. Darden had let him sleep in the holding cell just to keep him safe. And then 2 nights later, the man vanished. Now here he stood. Clean, fed, wearing boots polished enough to reflect the moonlight. You're one of them, Clara said. He shrugged, we're all one of something. She stepped forward, where is she? He raised a lantern. Behind him, a cliffside cave yawned open. Cold air spilled from its mouth like the breath of a dying god. Inside, the walls glimmered, not with gold but with glass. Dozens of bottles, each filled with pages. Confessions, he said, from every man who ever used that badge to hide behind. Clara stepped into the cave. She didn't flinch as the cold took her. Because her fire was older than winter. At the ranch, Darden was already preparing to leave. Ruth slammed the barn door as he hobbled past. You can't ride. I don't have to ride, he said. I have to lead. Ada stood nearby, eyes burning. She went alone because of us. No, Darden said, because of me. She was scared, Ruth whispered. She still is, Darden replied, and scared doesn't mean lost. He turned back. We finish this, we bring her home. But how? Ada asked. And Darden looked west, toward the place where the mountains dipped low and the horizon bled red. We go where the sky ends, that's where they wait. Clara walked deeper into the cave. Each step brought her past relics of lives long erased, old hats, burned journals, half-charred badges. At the far end she saw a table with 2 chairs. Her mother sat in one. Her hands weren't tied. Her eyes weren't blindfolded. But she was thinner, older, and there was something missing from her face, the defiance maybe, or the hope. You came, she said softly. I shouldn't have, Clara said. They would have taken one of you anyway. That's not a choice you get to make. Her mother lowered her gaze. I made it because I had to. I buried you, Clara snapped. I mourned you, we all did. I mourned you every day I was gone. Clara's voice shook. Then why stay away? Her mother pointed at the ceiling. Above them, a narrow shaft let in light from above, barely wide enough for a whisper. I've been watching, she said, since before your father died. Clara froze. He didn't die. Her mother's mouth twisted. No, she whispered, but I let the world think he did. Outside, the world was shifting. Ada rode first, her eyes tracing every track like scripture. Behind her, Ruth carried the old rifle from their grandfather's cabin, the one Clara used to call a thunderstick. Darden followed in a wagon. Not because he couldn't ride, but because he needed space for the others. The ones they might save, and the ones they might bury. They reached the cliffside by dusk. But no one waited. Not outside, because the storm was inside. Clara stood now, paced. I don't understand. You said they came for you. They did, her mother replied, but only because I wouldn't sign. Sign what? A list of names, men who'd agreed to help them shape the region, who promised not to interfere. So they killed him. Her mother shook her head. No, he escaped, but not far. Clara's voice cracked. You said he died. Her mother stood now too, and in her hands she held a piece of torn cloth, an old sheriff's star still pinned to it. I said what I had to, she said, but now it's your turn. To lie. No, her mother said, to decide. Gunfire tore through the cave. Clara ducked behind the table. Her mother threw the lantern against the far wall, plunging everything into shadow. Clara moved first, rolling, gun drawn, 2 shots fired back to back. She didn't know who the shooters were, just shadows, but that didn't matter. They'd chosen their side. She dove behind the cave wall, heart hammering. And then a voice echoed from the tunnel behind her. Clara. It was Ruth. Then Ada. And Darden's voice, calm as a storm before it breaks. Tell me where. Left flank, Clara called. And the cave filled with thunder. Darden moved like he'd never been shot. Ada dropped too, with precision that stunned even her sisters. Ruth held the entrance, firing once, then again, then lowering the rifle only when the dust settled. When the last man fell, there was silence. A heavy one. The kind that follows truth. Clara stepped from the shadows. Her sisters ran to her. Their mother stayed seated, bleeding. One of the stray shots had hit her in the ribs. Darden reached her side and knelt. I never stopped looking, he said. She smiled through blood. I knew you'd find me. I didn't, he said. They did. She looked at her daughters and whispered, I knew they would. That night the cave burned. The bottles, the papers, the confessions. All of it turned to ash. Not out of fear, but because the girls had seen enough of the past. And they weren't about to let it write their future. Their mother didn't die. Not there. She was taken to a quiet place. A ranch up north, far from the tracks, where the wind sang different songs, and the wolves kept to the hills. Clara visited first. Then Ada. Then Ruth. Each one stayed for a while. Then came home. Because home was where they had built something better. Not out of bricks or law, but out of each other. And the memory of a sheriff who once crawled across the desert with nothing but will and love keeping him breathing. The winter passed with its share of stillness, but the stillness never reached the bones of the Triplet girls. Not now. Not after what they dragged back with them from the desert. Every night since their return, Ruth would light the lanterns early, walk the fences slow, checking locks twice even if she didn't remember the first time. Ada kept her pistol under her pillow and a second tucked inside her boot. She stopped sleeping for more than 2 hours at a time. And Clara didn't go outside without her coat buttoned, even when it was warm. She said nothing of the bruises down her ribs, the shallow gash that hadn't healed over. She just kept looking west every morning as if the land might change its mind and spit more darkness back toward them. But what happened in that cave hadn't just ended there. It had stirred something. Like pulling a thorn that had festered beneath skin too long. Now the pain came from air touching raw flesh. That cave wasn't the only one. That group of men, the ones who had stolen their mother, hidden her for years, silenced whole trails of memory, they hadn't worked alone. Clara had taken something from one of the corpses before they'd burned it all, a torn half-map hand-drawn, lined with symbols, and in its corner a set of initials. Not the same as the letter. New ones. S.C. Ada ran it through the archives. Those letters were stamped on an old mining deed once buried under 20 years of court documents. The land was never used, never taxed, never sold, just held. And it lay 50 miles east. Across the border of the county. Across jurisdiction. They didn't tell Darden right away. Because they knew what he'd say. And because deep down, they'd already decided to go. The next night, Clara saddled the old gray. Ruth packed a box of cartridges. Ada tied her hair back and holstered both pistols without a word. Darden watched them from the porch. His hands didn't tremble, but his voice did. You remember what you're risking. Clara turned, shadows from the lantern striping her face. They came for her, then for us. They won't stop. Darden nodded once, then don't stop either. He handed Clara an old folded paper. His badge. Burnt around the edges, blackened down the center but still recognizable. Why now, she asked. He looked away. Because some fights require what you can't carry alone. They rode out before first light, avoiding the main roads. The trails they followed had no names, just tracks worn into stone by deer or time. The land got drier the farther they went, like the earth itself was preparing to forget. By dusk, they saw the first marker, a rusted post with no sign, just a rope tied to its center, swaying without wind. Ruth stopped. There's a smell, she said. Ada dropped from her horse, squatted and touched the ground. Ash. They followed it. Past dry washes and burnt-out trees, through gulches that curved like old scars. Until they reached it. A settlement. Or what had once tried to be. 8 buildings all empty. One church roof caved in. And a single well in the middle, its rope still intact. Clara stepped close, peered down. She heard nothing. Not water. Not echo. Just a silence so thick it pushed against her ears. She turned. He's here. How do you know? Ruth asked. Clara didn't answer. But her hand was on her holster. And her eyes were scanning the shadows. They waited until moonrise. Then movement. A figure walked from the church ruins. Not hurried. Not armed. Just tall, slow, and whistling. It was a hymn. A familiar one. Their mother used to sing it while stirring stew. Ada gripped the rifle. That song. I hear it, Clara said. The man stopped 10 feet from them. Hat low. Coat long and stained. He smiled without warmth. You brought his badge, he said, nodding at Clara's pocket. Who are you? She demanded. I used to be someone's son. That doesn't answer anything. He looked around. Neither does this place anymore. Ruth stepped forward. You sent the letters. He cocked his head. Letters were just invitations you accepted. Why our mother? Ada asked. He laughed softly. You really want the story? Only if it ends with you in the ground, Clara replied. He smiled again. And raised his hands. Not in surrender. In invitation. Then come hear it. Inside the church, it was darker than the cave had been. Worse maybe because of what used to live there. Hope, reverence, song, now just rot. The pews were warped, pulpit gone, but a single chair remained. Behind it, a large canvas nailed to the wall. It showed a town, peaceful, men on porches, women carrying baskets, children playing. The man tapped the canvas. That's what we were building. Ada stared. Who's we? He didn't answer. Just reached into his coat and pulled a folded sheet. He handed it to Clara. It was a list of names. More than 30. Next to each a mark. Some black. Some red. And at the bottom, SC. She looked up. That's you. He shook his head. That's him. And from the shadows behind the canvas, someone else stepped forward. Old, thin, eyes hollow. He wore no gun, no boots, just rags and a rope around his waist. I told you not to bring them, he said. They brought themselves, the first man replied. Ruth raised her rifle. Who are you? He smiled. Your grandfather. Silence. Then Clara stepped forward. That's not true. Oh, it is, he said. She wouldn't speak of me, because I chose differently. I chose to protect this valley from what was coming, to make peace with the power instead of dying by it. Ada's voice was ice. You let them take your own daughter. He nodded, to save everyone else. She's alive, Clara said. She remembers what you did. He didn't flinch. I know, he whispered. I wake up hearing her scream. Then he looked at them, eyes clear. But you don't understand the war. Ruth fired first. Straight into the wood beside his head. He didn't blink. But the first man moved fast. Too fast. He had Clara by the wrist in a blink, twisting her to the side. Her gun clattered to the floor. Ruth turned, but the old man shouted, Stop. Everyone froze. Ada held her breath. Then Clara, struggling, slammed her elbow into the man's ribs. He grunted. She broke free. And then the room erupted. It wasn't clean. It wasn't just. It wasn't even planned. But it ended with the first man dead. A knife Clara had carried at her waist buried in his throat. The old man didn't run. Didn't fight. He just knelt by the canvas and whispered, it was never supposed to go this far. Ruth stepped forward. Lowered her rifle. Tell that to the graves we found. The old man closed his eyes. And nodded once. Then bury me beside them. But they never told anyone where it happened. They never filed reports. They burned the canvas. Left the bodies. Sealed the well. Because some endings aren't meant for stories. Some are meant to be left where they fall. But when they got home, they didn't sleep for days. Because the weight of what they carried wasn't just in their minds, it was in their bones. Their mother met them at the porch. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She just held them. One by one. As if she knew the storm had passed. But the flood would take longer. By the end of that winter, the snow didn't melt the same way it used to. The rivers that ran past the tree line seemed quieter. The soil cracked longer before it softened. And the house on the edge of town, where the triplets once played in the yard before supper, stood a little straighter now, not because time had been kind to it, but because the women inside no longer bent beneath it. The triplets didn't speak much of what had happened beyond the ridge. They didn't need to. That silence wove itself into their routines. Ada would cook breakfast early and always fry one extra egg. No one asked why, and no one ever ate it. Ruth spent more hours than needed brushing the horses, humming the same hymn over and over. And Clara began planting. Rows and rows of things she didn't even name. Just small green bursts, life where there'd been dust, quiet where there'd been screams. Their mother, Mary, no longer kept to the dark corners. The fire in her had returned slowly, like someone learning to speak again after years of being mute. Some mornings she would stand in the window for a long time, a steaming mug in her hand, watching the field where her daughters had once practiced lassoing fence posts. The sheriff's badge sat on the mantel, charred and cracked but still intact. No one had touched it in weeks. They didn't need to. Then came the rider. He came without sound. No dust trail, no whistle. Just a glint off his buckle and a slow, dragging step as he dismounted in front of the gate. Ruth was the first to see him. She was sweeping the porch, didn't even flinch. Company, she said loud enough for the house to hear. Ada and Clara came quick. Each wore a revolver now, not in fear, but because old lessons never stopped teaching. The man didn't raise a hand, didn't smile. He looked like stone. Tall, older, but not aged. A U.S. Marshal star pinned clean to his chest. I'm looking for the girls, he said. They're women, Mary called from inside, stepping out with her apron still on, flour dusting her arms. And you'd better have a good reason. He took off his hat. Held it against his chest. My name's Marshall Thorne. I came on account of the bodies. Nobody moved. He went on. 2 weeks ago, a scout found remains in a gulch outside the old Bethel Ridge outpost. Church ruins, ashes, bone, 2 sets. One man had a warrant on him going back 16 years. The other matches a missing person case from before that. And Clara asked. Marshall Thorne looked at each of them slowly. We've got questions, folks up north, folks who lost people, families that never buried sons. Ada's voice cut through. Then bury them now, it's over. He didn't answer right away. Just stared at the sheriff's badge, resting on the mantel behind them through the screen door. I read his file, he said. Darden S. He nodded. You know he turned in his star before he disappeared, said he wasn't fit to wear it anymore. He was wrong, Ruth said. I believe you. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick envelope, held it out. Clara took it. Opened it. Inside were documents, stamped, signed. A letter of reinstatement. And transfer of title. To who, she asked. Thorne tilted his chin slightly. You three. Ada's jaw set. That's not how law works. No, he said, but it's how truth does, and we're short on lawmen who tell the truth anymore. Mary stepped down off the porch. Took the envelope from Clara's hands. Glanced through it once. Then handed it back. If this means more trouble, you'll find trouble dead before it finds us. Marshall Thorne smiled for the first time. And nodded. Then you'll be hearing from me again. He mounted his horse. Rode out without another word. And the wind behind him felt different. Like it respected the place now. But over the next months, things changed. Word spread, not about the cave, not about the church, but about the girls. How they'd gone into the desert alone. Returned with their heads high. How they never asked the town for help. But kept helping anyway. One night a widow came knocking. Her boy hadn't come home from the mountain trail. The sheriff's office in town said they were short-staffed. The girls rode out within the hour, found him 2 days later, broken leg, fever, alive. Another time, the general store was robbed. The thief never reached the county line. Ruth cornered him with a lasso and let Clara do the talking. He confessed before the cuffs went on. The town didn't ask who was in charge anymore. They just brought pies to the house. Thank you notes nailed to the fence. Sometimes, a coin or two slipped into Ada's coat pocket at church. Not payment. Just tribute. One evening, Mary sat with Darden by the fire. He'd returned after the frost thawed, slow on his feet but sharp as ever. He brought with him a crate full of old documents, maps, names, and newspaper clippings. He said he wanted to burn them all, but Ruth insisted they be archived. Truth needs proof, she said, even if no one ever asks. Darden leaned back, staring into the firelight. You think it's really done? He asked Mary. She nodded. They buried their ghosts. Now they're making room for the living. But then came the boy. The one about the sheriff they found dying in the middle of nowhere. And how 3 girls born into grief, raised by grit and trained by pain, didn't just save him. They became what he couldn't finish being. Law, vengeance, mercy. All in one. Not for fame. Not for coin. But because someone had to. And it was their turn.